Hello, this is our lecture number 11, and we're going to be talking about Ivan Pavlov, and we're going to be learning a little bit about classical conditioning. So we have quite a bit that we want to cover, so let's get right in. Typically, in the study of psychology in a survey course in psychology, we are looking at two basic types of learning. One, which is considered to be a little bit more fundamental, not as complex as what we call classical or Pavlovian conditioning, named after Ivan Pavlov. And then another type of learning that we talk about is what we call operant or Skinnerian conditioning, which was named after B.F. Skinner. So first, what we will do is we will tackle the study of classical conditioning. Then we'll follow it with the study of the more complex type of learning. Um, if we take a look at this entire area, it is, I think, very informative because it helps us to understand some of the lessons that are involved in how science actually progresses. I like to tell students that some of the most important discoveries that have been made, not only in psychology, but in other disciplines, they happen by way of accident, something that we call serendipity. And there are many, many different examples of this, and certainly we'll be talking about those as we go along. But classical conditioning and its discovery is a wonderful example of this. And secondly, this gives us an opportunity to talk about how basic research can be translated ultimately to very important applications. And again, some of the therapies that are used today in order to treat individuals that are suffering from things like phobias are really dependent upon what Ivan Pavlov found so many years ago in his laboratory, because those principles of treatment are ones that are really dependent upon an understanding of Pavlovian classical conditioning. So again, a couple of really good lessons to be learned here as we go along. The discovery of classical conditioning is a really interesting story. Most people commonly associate the discovery with Ivan Pavlov, and in a sense that's true. But in another sense, there's another individual who also played a role in this, and his name was E.B. Twittmeyer. He was a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania. And he really was the actual discoverer of classical conditioning a year before Ivan Pavlov reported on it in 1903. So this is E.B. Twittmeyer that you see right here. And he was doing some very interesting work at the University of Pennsylvania at the time, in which he was simply recording the knee-jerk response, simple reflex in experimental subjects. And what he would do is he would take a rubber hammer and with the subject that was sitting on a side of a table or on a bench, and he would strike the individual just below the kneecap on the patellar tendon. And typically what he would see is this rise that occurs in the leg. This is a reflex, this what we call the knee-jerk response. And again, this is something that when you go into a doctor's office, this is routinely done in the physical examination in order to test the integrity of your central nervous system. This is a basic reflex. So what Twittmeyer would do in his studies was he would have individuals in which he would be, gently tapping them with this hammer, which has a rubber end on it. And he had a device which would hold that rubber hammer and come down when it was released and strike very precisely on the individual's knee. And he would record this knee-jerk reflex, this knee-jerk response. Well, as time went on, there were some subjects who didn't like the fact that this was kind of catching them by surprise, because one of the things that Pavlov did was he had a screen here just above where the hammer dropped, so the volunteer subject couldn't really see when the hammer was going to drop. So they asked Twitmeyer to provide them with some kind of a cue, a signal that the hammer was going to drop, and Twitmeyer agreed and said, sure, no problem. What I'll do is I'll just sound this bell, and the bell will mean that the hammer is going to drop down on your knee, on your patellar tendon. And in one subject in which this had been done several hundred times, where the bell sounded and the hammer dropped, what happened was there was a malfunctioning that occurred in terms of the dropping of the hammer, and the bell sounded, but the hammer did not drop. But curiously, what happened was the individual's leg flexed up in the air, this knee-jerk response, again, in the absence of the hammer dropping. So E.B. Twitmeyer found this to be very curious. He repeated this in a number of different subjects that had also had the bell associated with the dropping of the hammer, and then he would just sound the bell and the hammer would not drop, but yet the knee would flex up in the air. And he wrote up a report on this. It was called Knee Jerks Without Stimulation of the Patellar Tendon. And he wrote up a paper that he wanted to deliver at a meeting of the American Psychological Association, which in that year was held in Baltimore, Maryland. And the conference was a 4-day-long conference, and his paper was to be delivered at one section that was at the very end of the conference, and there were very few people there, and very few, if any, people were interested in it. Discouraged, E.B. Twitmeyer went back to the University of Pennsylvania and never really pursued this topic any longer. And indeed, very few people knew about it other than that report, which was at a meeting of the American Psychological Association. So again, now we go, across the ocean to Ivan Pavlov's laboratory, and we learn about his discovery, which was occurring at just about the same time as E.B. Twitmeyer at the University of Pennsylvania. And here's Ivan Pavlov, and let's learn a little bit about him. He's really an interesting individual. Born in 1848, lives until 1936. He was trained in medical school, and his research was in the area of physiology. He studied the physiology of the digestive process, and indeed he won the Nobel Prize for this work in 1904 for the contribution that salivation makes to the functioning of our gastric system. And indeed, this was, incredibly important work which, led to his winning the Nobel Prize. Ivan Pavlov could not have been less interested in the study of behavior. Again, he was, by training, he was a physiologist. But he also went through all the various rotations that a doctor would go through in their training. Indeed, went through a psychiatric rotation, which will become significant a little bit later on as we get into his story a little bit more. But again, initially, he could not have been less interested in the study of behavior. Certainly not interested at all in the study of learning. Let's learn about his story and learn about how he happened upon classical conditioning. What you see there is a dog that has in its mouth something that's called a fistula. If we can surgically place this in the dog's mouth and exterior of the dog's mouth so that we can collect saliva. So this is how Pavlov went about collecting saliva in the dogs that he was working with. And the dog that he was working with at the time was in a cage in a room by itself. And every day Pavlov would come in, walk down the corridor, open up the door to this dog's room. And he would take a box of food, of powdered food. It was meat powder, pulverized meat that was in powder form. And he would take the box down from a shelf that was in the room, and he would open up the box and he would take some of it out in his fingers, and then he would take it and place it on the dog's mouth. And the dog would lap it up. And the dog would soon begin to salivate. So he would do this day after day after day after day. And then what he found was, after doing this for a period of time, a period of maybe about a week to 10 days, what he finds is the dog starts to salivate prior to the time that the food is placed upon the dog's mouth. So, for example, just the sound of hearing Pavlov coming into the room was enough to provoke the salivation, or Pavlov actually reaching for the box of food prompted the dog to begin to salivate. So there are all these things that had been associated with the delivery of the food now, which in and of themselves were provoking the animal to begin to salivate. Well, Pavlov called this psychic secretions, and indeed realized that this was a very interesting and unexpected finding, and he now started to divert almost all of his time and energy to the study of this particular phenomenon. So if we look at Pavlov's original experiment, what he did was he took a dog and placed it in what we call a Pavlovian harness, which is these leather straps that you see here, which keep the dog in place. The dog is sitting up on top of a table. Here is a bell that is above the dog, and strings that Pavlov can manipulate in order to sound the bell. This is a device that you see here that is used in order to record the amount of salivation that takes place. And we have this device here where we can swing food into to the dog so that the dog can eat it. This is pulverized meat, this meat powder. So what Pavlov is going to do is he's going to sound the bell. Then he's going to present the food, and he's going to measure the amount of salivation that takes place. So he does this many times, sounds the bell, presents the food, measures the amount of salivation, and does it over and over and over again. And then what he does is he simply sounds the bell. This bell now having been connected with the presentation of the food many times before. And what he finds is that now just presenting the bell is enough to produce the salivation. So again, the bell has been connected with the presentation of the food. The bell now has acquired what we call associative properties. The bell alone now is capable of producing the salivary response. Take a look at what is called the classical conditioning paradigm. Again, we have a situation where we present the food and the dog salivates. This is an automatic response. This occurs every single time. We call this food the unconditioned stimulus. The salivation that occurs is called the unconditioned response. So again, this is an automatic response in the same way in which, for example, you would withdraw your hand from a hot stove. That's an automatic involuntary response. If a puff of air suddenly comes towards your eye, you close your eye down. That too is an automatic response. So no, this is a reflexive response here. Food is producing salivation. The unconditioned stimulus produces the unconditioned response. Now, ordinarily, if we were to present a bell to a dog, it would probably produce a little bit of a response, maybe some kind of an orienting response, but certainly it would not produce salivation. But what if we connected the bell with the food, this neutral stimulus, this bell. So the bell sounds just prior to the time that the food is presented, and the dog salivates. This is a neutral stimulus, but if we do this a number of times, present the bell, then present the food to the dog, and the dog salivates. What happens is the bell becomes connected with the food. And if we were just now to present the bell without the food, the bell would produce the salivation in the dog. Now the bell is referred to as a conditioned stimulus because that stimulus now in and of itself is capable of provoking this salivary response. So again, I think that this is something that you need to go over a number of times. I think once you do, you will understand classical conditioning in its simplest form. We're taking a neutral stimulus, we're combining it with a stimulus that has meaning to the animal, in this case, food. It is producing salivation. That bell now acquires associative properties. The bell now, having been repeatedly connected with the presentation of the food, that bell alone now has a very significant property to it. The dog now has learned that the bell typically is associated with the food, and the bell now has acquired this ability to produce this salivary response. Now, let's take a look at a number of key factors that are involved in conditioning. One key factor is what we call the frequency of pairings. Pavlov found that the more frequently he combined the bell with the food, okay, the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, the greater was the likelihood that conditioning would take place. So, for example, if he just paired the food and the bell maybe 5 times. So he presents the bell, then the food, and the dog salivates, and he does this 5 times. There was really very little conditioning that took place, again, when he examines this by just presenting the bell alone after just 5 pairings of the bell and the food. Little salivation takes place. But if there was 100 pairings, of the bell and the food, then this produced very, very strong conditioning. So he finds then that the frequency of these pairings is incredibly. There are also temporal factors involved, meaning the presentation of the bell must come just before the presentation of the food. If it occurs too far in advance of the food being delivered, or if it occurs after the food is delivered, then learning doesn't really occur. What Pavlov finds is that the optimum period of time is about 0.5 seconds, a half a second. That is presentation of the bell and then immediate presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, the food. Remember, we talked before about contiguity, closeness in time of 2 events. That is absolutely crucial in terms of classical conditioning. If he presents the bell several minutes before the unconditioned stimulus, then you get little or no conditioning. If the food is presented and then is followed by the bell, again, little or no conditioning. So again, the best conditioning takes place with this temporal relationship here of the bell sounding and then immediately afterward, the food is presented. This becomes very important for a number of things that we'll be discussing later on. Another factor is this thing called extinction. What Pavlov found was that conditioned responses can be unlearned really rapidly. If you just present the bell alone after it has been presented in association with the food many times, what you get is this diminished response that is after a period of time where we're presenting just the bell alone, you eventually get extinction. That is, the animal stops salivating. So again, this extinction is something that is process is one in which, again, presentation of the condition stimulus, that produces that very robust conditioned response. Again, take a look at this acquisition that we see here, and repeated presentation of that of the bell alone produces eventually a very weak conditioned response. And again, if you do this repeatedly, the dog extinguishes. That is, the salivary response simply goes away. So this again is something that he studies, this phenomenon of extinction. He also finds that extinguished responses aren't necessarily forgotten. So what he did was to take some dogs and he extinguished them. And then several weeks later, he places them back in the same situation. And what he finds is that the dogs relearn this conditioned response very rapidly, much quicker than the original learning. So presentation of the conditioned stimulus alone, that eventually produces extinction. Many days later, start presenting the CS and the UCS. And you get what looks like, some memory. And indeed, what Pavlov believed was that there were some fundamental permanent changes that were taking place when an animal learned a particular response. So that it's not completely forgotten. So that too becomes a very interesting finding by Ivan Pavlov. What he also found was that time alone can be a conditioned stimulus. Consider, for example, an experiment that he conducted where he presented food to the dog every 4 hours. So again, around the clock, every 4 hours, he's placing some of this meat powder on the dog's mouth. And eventually what he finds is the dog starts to salivate a little bit before that 4-hour period of time. That is at about 3 hours and 45 minutes before the food is even presented. This is what we call temporal conditioning. That is, the passage of time can serve as a conditioned stimulus. Now, if you take a look at this really simple example, and it's one that I draw from my own background, you can, I regularly set my alarm clock for 6 a.m. in the morning. And what happens is I usually, I go to bed at about the same time every night, and I usually get up about 20 to 30 minutes before the alarm clock goes off. And again, this is a perfect example of this thing that we call temporal conditioning. That is, that time alone can serve as a conditioned stimulus. Now, another key finding of Pavlov is that of what is called spontaneous recovery. If you were to take a dog, for example, and return that dog to a place where it had been conditioned, it will result in the reappearance of that conditioned response in the absence of any explicit stimuli. So here we have acquisition of this conditioned response. We're presenting the bell in conjunction with the food. Then we're going to extinguish the animal and simply present the bell alone, and extinction occurs. And then there's this long delay that occurs. And then we place the animal back in the apparatus, back into the room where it was conditioned, and we can see this phenomenon called spontaneous recovery, where you get some salivation that occurs just by bringing the animal into the room. Eventually it extinguishes if the bell does not sound, but you get a little bit of what we call spontaneous recovery. So again, this is a response in which there are many things that have been associated with it. And again, bringing that organism back into that particular situation, you are able to document this thing called spontaneous recovery. Two very important phenomena in classical conditioning that Pavlov studies: the stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Let me describe them to you and also give you examples, some common examples of them. Stimulus generalization. What would happen if you presented tones of different frequencies? You know, you're using that as your conditioned stimulus. You're looking at salivation, okay, in response to food. And you do this many times where you combine this 200 hertz tone with the presentation of the food, and you get this very robust conditioned response, the salivation. But what if you now start introducing instead tones that are different, such as higher tones, 300 hertz or 400 hertz, or tones that are lower, like a 100 hertz tone? Well, what you see is that this related stimulus, these are sounds that differ in terms of frequency from the original conditioned stimulus. You still get some salivation. These are responses now that we call generalized responses. This is what we call stimulus generalization, that again, stimuli that are close to that original stimulus are indeed producing some salivation. Those that are distant, however, you get very little salivation. Okay, so again, this is something that is called stimulus generalization. And indeed, there are many examples of this. You know, a child that's bitten by a large dog. On future occasions, a small dog might be just as scary to the child. You also see it in predator-prey relationships. When a predator makes a slightly different sound or is seen from a different angle, its prey can still respond very quickly. So in other words, it doesn't have to see the whole stimulus. These are very good examples of this thing that we call stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is another important phenomenon that Pavlov studied. An organism can learn to respond to one stimulus and not another. For example, if we were to present this on a piece of poster board to a dog, this square, and then follow it by food powder placed upon the dog's mouth, and then periodically present this circle, and not follow it by any food powder, what we would find is that eventually the dog would respond to the square by exhibiting this salivary response, but would not exhibit any salivary response to this circle that was presented to the dog. This is what we refer to as stimulus discrimination, responding one way to one stimulus and another way to a different stimulus. Take a look at some, a common example of this. Stimulus discrimination really keeps us alive. If you take a look at when you're driving, for example, and you come to an intersection and the light turns red, you take your foot off of the accelerator and you place it on the brake. This is stimulus discrimination. The light turns green and now you take your foot off of the brake and you put it on the accelerator. So indeed, both stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination absolutely keep us alive. Let's talk now about probably the most famous experiment that Pavlov conducted, and it is one that he did on the phenomena that we refer to as experimental neurosis. What Pavlov does is he classically conditions the dog to this circle. That is, the circle, when it's presented visually to the dog, is followed by reinforcement, followed by the food powder placed upon the dog's mouth. But whenever this oval is presented, it is not followed by the food powder placed upon the dog's mouth. So eventually what happens is the dog is responding now to the circle by salivating, but shows no response to the oval. So now what Pavlov does is he plays a trick on the animal. He starts introducing other objects now that they're circles that are starting to look more oval in their shape, as you see here. So he intersperses these with the presentation of the circle and the presentation of the oval. And what he finds is that the dog's behavior breaks down. The dog begins to become confused, become very emotional, starts to bark and to urinate and defecate. These are all emotional responses, and even tries to bite Pavlov and his technicians. This was a very interesting phenomena that he found, that the dog's behavior looked like that of a neurotic human being. Pavlov took a look at some of his records from when he was in school, when he was going through the psychiatric rotations, especially where he was in mental health clinics, and he could very distinctly recall working with some patients whose behavior was not unlike what he saw in the case of those dogs. So Pavlov concludes then that this experimental neurosis that he produced in this dog was something that was learned, and this convinces Pavlov then that mental illness may be learned. And indeed, if it is learned, it can be unlearned. There is no more important and provocative statement in the history of psychology than Pavlov's observations here about this phenomena that we call experimental neurosis. Take a look at the single most famous experiment in the history of psychology, that performed by John Watson. The first thing that comes to mind that you need to be aware of is that John Watson's very famous experiment probably was unethical. This is work that he did with a 9-month-old child by the name of Albert. We still don't really know what happened to Albert. His fate largely is still unknown. This is an experiment that very poor controls. Watson was really subjectively analyzing fear in little Albert, and again, poorly controlled and unethical. Completely unethical experiment. An experiment like this simply could not be done in this day and age. So this very famous experiment, Albert and the White Rat, the basic things that you need to know is certainly classical conditioning is producing an emotional response. A 9-month-old Albert is exposed to a variety of different stimuli, all of which he really enjoys and likes. But then what Watson is going to do is he's going to associate a loud noise with the presentation of this rat that Albert has been playing with, and Albert now becomes conditioned to fear the rat. Whenever he sees the white rat, he becomes very emotional and he begins to cry. So take a look at this experiment. Here is John Watson that you see right here. Here is little Albert. This is Albert's mother. Again, this was a woman who lived just down the street from John Watson in Baltimore. And she agreed to bring her child in. And here's Albert playing with this white rat. And indeed, what Pavlov is going to do is he has this steel bar that's hanging in the back of the room, and he's going to take a hammer, and when Albert is playing with the white rat, he sounds this gong by striking with this hammer this large steel bar, and now we have this incredible emotional response that is produced in Albert, and Albert now becomes afraid of the white rat, and indeed anything that is a furry object, like a slipper, for example, or a fur coat, the fear has generalized. Stimuli now that are similar to, again, this is stimulus generalization, really, that are similar to that white rat provoke the same kind of conditioned response. So indeed, the fear now has generalized. This is psychology's single most important experiment. And indeed, this woman that you see here, Mary Cover Jones, produces a technique called counter conditioning in order to try to get rid of that phobic response, to get rid of that fear. And it's a very simple process. Mary Cover Jones says you can't give two incompatible responses to the same conditioned stimulus. In other words, you can't feel both fearful and relaxed at the same time. So what she's going to do is she's going to attach a response other than fear to the conditioned stimulus. So for example, what she does is she makes sure that the rat is not in the room when Albert comes into the room. But she might take the rat and put it up way up on a shelf that's very high and away from the immediate visual field of Albert. And what she's going to do is she's going to bring some things into the laboratory that Albert likes, things like maybe some food that he likes or some toys that he likes to play with. So again, he wants to get Albert completely relaxed and does this over a series of days. And what she will do is she'll slowly each day introduce the rat to Albert, bringing a little bit closer each day, but making sure that Albert is relaxed. And eventually, over time, what we find is that now the rat becomes a signal, really. It's become associated with relaxation. So again, this was the principle of what is called classical conditioning. Mary Cover Jones is considered to be the first behavior therapist. You take a look now at therapies that are based on classical conditioning. Joseph Volpe has really perfected this in the treatment of fears. Common phobias, for example, like fear of flying, which certainly affects many, many individuals. What he does is he constructs what he calls a hierarchy of fears with the individual on the first few sessions that they have. So certainly looking at pictures of an airplane in flight would probably be the least feared situation. Then purchasing an airline ticket might be the next most feared situation. Packing in preparation for a flight certainly might provoke some fear. Driving to the airport on the day of the flight, parking a car at the airport, getting a boarding pass at the gate. Certainly now the level of fear is becoming very high. Boarding an airplane, then ultimately getting seated and ready for takeoff, and then finally in the airplane flying. So what Volpe is going to do is through a series of many sessions, he'll start out with this least feared situation, engage the individual in relaxation training, and showing these pictures of an airplane in flight, again, making sure that the individual is relaxed before they proceed up to the next most feared situation, that of actually purchasing an airline ticket. So indeed, we progress very slowly up this hierarchy. And again, we never proceed up to the next level until we know that the individual is completely relaxed. Many of you may have actually seen individuals that are in the last stages of this systematic desensitization, where they're actually at the airport with their therapist and they take a short flight. I know that they do this at the Albany airport, for example. And they'll take a short flight from Albany to Baltimore. This is the last stage of this systematic desensitization training. So this is a very interesting story. Obviously, this is going to have great importance for later on when we begin to talk about various treatments for behavior disorders like phobias. And indeed, we've gone from discovery of these very simple experiments that were conducted by Pavlov so long ago that have now led to the utilization in treatment of individuals that are suffering from various types of mental disorder. So in our next class, next lecture, we'll begin to explore some common examples of this, some real life examples of this to help you to understand classical conditioning a little bit better.